So just to add to that, I don't dispute for a second that the rate of innovation is easier, or that we've flattened barriers to entry, we might have increased barriers to exit, different problem, but nevertheless, I think there's a much, much broader base of innovation around the world and many more opportunities. And what we're learning the hard way, and we're learning it if you just rewind the tape and you look at the massive series of enormous failures, post-Dodd-Frank failures in finance and governance and leadership failures, the fact that aircraft CEOs are selling safety critical instruments as an aftermarket thing just illustrates the problems, right? The Volkswagen cheap device debacle is a governance failure of epic proportions. So governance, to me, I agree with the statement that governance is the sort of the next frontier. And then you also have to, when you think about what it is to govern a modern institution or any institution, we also have to look at the structural issues, right? The government today and governance today is a traditional pyramid. The narrowest body makes the most consequential decisions. So the UN Security Council are the ones that are going to vote on whether to go to war or send in peacekeepers. The General Assembly is largely there for ceremonial purposes largely, right? And if you start to flip the script on its head and have a governance model where the base of the pyramid has the decision-making power for the most consequential decisions, you could then start building new institutional models. And part of what excited me the most about Libra is that at least what we're putting in place in the last 6 months is a model in which the 100 votes of the council are the ones that enshrine the most important decisions in the project. And to really see that being exercised behind closed doors and sort of on the stage as part of building trust in this project because people didn't like the initial messenger is our one big advantage. And if we get that right, I think we can do a lot of positive things with this project.
So I want to hear from Brian and also get to this in much greater detail over the course of the conversation. But what Libra has done, in my mind, the most intriguing innovation associated with the project has nothing to do with the technology. This is the first time that a major tech provider has created a population scale platform and then immediately turned over governance to a multi-stakeholder entity. Is that correct? And if it is correct, then what does this say about the future of tech development? Is this an admission on the part of the existing incumbents that they are no longer the right entities to take ownership of these governance challenges?
Yeah, and I think the best emblem of that, and this I quote you on this a lot, Tomicah, is if you look at the Edelman Trust Barometer, institutional trust of both public and private institutions is at its lowest point ever. And the thing humanity no longer trusts in those institutions, whether it's democracy, whether it's private sector, is that we all now know, and we have an enormous body of proof, that bad things happen behind those closed doors, right? And so the best way to flip that on its head is to say open, transparent governance, and that the code base should not be the source of competitive advantage for any one enterprise. And so, that's why I think it's pretty easy, even in the short run of this effort, to say that this is digital commons. That if the code base is open source, we already have developers all over the world working on the testnet, building out this platform. And whereas the first round of technology innovation, it was value capture. It went largely to a couple of places on the planet and created tech titans and an embarrassment of riches, but not a lot of that was disseminated in a broad way. And we have a chance, we have to flip the script on that.
Thanks. Brian?
So I'm going to do my best with voice battling a cold. Apologies for that. Definitely agree that technology has greater leverage power today than ever. It's easier and faster to move fast and break more things, right? And that has caused a whole bunch of reckoning out there in the marketplace and amongst innovators, certainly thinking hard. You see this in artificial intelligence about the ethics of the application of their technologies. But there is an old trade as well going, especially in digital technologies, around, for building a networked environment. Let's talk about how that should look and how that should work. Back to the earliest days of the internet, there was, it was researchers initially working together on what are the common standards that we should adopt using very ad hoc standards bodies like the Internet Engineering Task Force. They happened to use free software to show here's how to connect our devices and into a network and send email to each other because that made it easy to get adoption out there, right? And that continued through the rise of the web, that continued through the rise of a lot of the infrastructure we have today, this resonance between open standards, open source software that implemented those standards, and then you started to need some governance, just a little bit of what I'd started to what I would call minimum viable governance through organizations like ICANN, right? That said, okay, here's the root level of the domain name system. Let's just come to the basic agreement about how to farm out kind of the top level and try to set us, policies for registering domain names, and then the whole ecosystem can flourish around that, right? And as we've seen with blockchain technology and others, finding the right balancing act in all three of these domains. What are the standards for how blockchains should talk to each other? Let's build open source software to do that. That's what we do at Hyperledger. And really broadly at the Linux Foundation, that's what we do in all these other domains, cloud computing, software-defined networking, et cetera. And then really though the question is, now that we have the technology, how do we wire them up to do trade finance networks, to do supply chain networks, to do digital identity networks in a way that kind of avoids centralization on the part of either a government or a private actor? How do we avoid the world looking like the kind of relationships that Uber has with its drivers or Airbnb has with its guests and hosts, right? Those are two great companies, but they are centralized platforms. And I think most of the world wants to find cooperative ways to build these kind of networks. And that's really, I think, the big challenge as we see blockchain scaling to these kinds of national and international types of applications.
So I want to excavate that last point a little bit more. Governance at its core is a technology for managing society in the same way that finance is a technology for managing risk. So it is a mechanism for working through difficult challenges, reconciling a lot of different needs, and hopefully, when done right, delivering citizens what they need to realize their aspirations and live good lives. When it comes to tech governance in particular, we have seen a number of models emerge that you touch on that seem to be, by broad estimation, falling short. We have the centralized structures, your Ubers or your Airbnbs or your Googles. We won't pick on Facebook since that's happened elsewhere in the course of our conversations, but we could, where a lot of data is aggregated by central actors. That data is provided by a lot of individuals for their own reasons. And the net result is something that looks a lot like a feudal system. And again, Chamath Palihapitiya has made this point. If we're all doing the work and all of the benefits are being derived by a handful of people sitting in Silicon Valley or Seattle, then something's wrong here. This is not a viable path forward. What are the alternatives? Because the other alternative that seems to exist is the authoritarian model that is emerging in China, which also is pretty unsettling for a variety of reasons. What models should we be looking at? What's out there that could provide us a third way?
If you pick up an old manual for a database product, you'll probably see the terminology master-slave. Right, which seems crazy today, and hopefully no one creates a database book, publishes a book out there that uses that terminology today. But it was the easiest computer architecture in the world to say all the interesting stuff is at the center, and all my clients are at the core. That's the mainframe model, right? That we've just kind of danced on the edge of for the last 50 years. Decentralized systems are hard. They have an economic disadvantage. They have an operational disadvantage. They're slower. And anybody who talks about any blockchain use case, it'll always be faster to do with a centralized server somewhere. So it's natural that as Silicon Valley grew, as the technologies grew, the easiest answer to any problem was put a big honking server in the middle and we'll just scale it, right? What you see in the blockchain space, and again, it's perhaps trite to cite Satoshi Nakamoto. I might cite John Gilmore as one of the early founders of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and others who really said, the decentralization of the internet in the 90s when it came out, of the early web before everyone was using Gmail and Google, right? Those were not just kind of accidents of history or academic research projects. There was an intentional design there, and I think Satoshi picked up on that, and the people who've kind of carried the torch after that have picked up. And it doesn't have to be, 100 million nodes out there all equal. It can be decentralization in a given industry between the top 10 players in that industry. It can be between participants in a supply chain. It's a balance of interests. And we have governance models like that today already outside of the technology domain. There's industry associations in every industry that try to strike that balance, right? So I think it's about trying to model those human governance and institutions and policies into just enough code to try to automate that. But none of the blockchain systems that we see out there or the governance models that work without having humans somewhere in that core, having conversations about the right way to build this, the right way to evolve it. It's that balance of human governance and automated governance that I think will carry the day.
And I was just going to add a point to that. I think the reflection that the internet undoubtedly sort of removed friction from information sharing and communication, but it also enabled people to start doing things that would otherwise require centralized empires, right? So freelancing journalists and people armed with their iPhones in Tahrir Square, capturing things that would have otherwise been blacked out because traditional industry and traditional models had single points of failure. The issue there, and from the rent-seeking point of view that you just raised, is that notwithstanding the fact that we've liberated many industries from traditional shackles, we haven't liberated the way economic gain can flow from traditional shackles. And that's the problem. I think that for blockchain and its original vision, an internet for payments and the ability to enable sort of micropayments and fractionalization, that's where we think there's a really, really compelling next wave where people get to participate in the fruits of that labor, have a couple more gateways between their personal information and these enterprises so that there's a trade-off there. So that the two things can move in lockstep and it's not just one-sided. That's the tension. We're sort of side hustling to make ends meet in most Western world countries. We've run out of the runway in terms of trusted institutions, and we need to really start challenging the way value is captured, stored, and to whom it goes in the global economy. And that's as much a governance issue as it is about building technologies and other platforms that can scale.
Just a quick comment on the central server. One of the things we hear a lot from governments these days is that the old way of doing things was much more of the central server. So you would have a centralized government that would go in, talk to experts, academics, maybe talk to citizens here and there, but it wasn't part of the natural course of doing things, unless you had an angry neighbor, call up, and I've been on those desks before. And then you would cascade out policy, and you would try to make that cascading out policy as good as you could, and then you would review it if it went wrong. Now, because of this in our lives as consumers, we have much more distributed possibility, and that expectation is being built into the governance systems. So one of the number one things we hear from our platform is, how do you actually really do citizen engagement in a way that isn't token? It doesn't want to just be, I'm going to throw you a survey. How are we really going to do it? And as it relates to that, and I like to break down this trust thing, because it's an easy trope to throw out around people don't trust government or any big institutions. They don't trust centralized governments, the big mega servers. But if you get closer, trust in the brain is a matter of proximity. If you get closer to the government and the citizens, which, by the way, government is citizens. They're not robots yet. They're actually people who are citizens. We had our former commissioner here. You're a real person with children, and you care.
And a nickname.
And with a nickname, who's using that for good. It's going to get better. And so if I kind of had a takeaway for all of you from me, please don't keep repeating this. The trust is broken. It's a proximity issue. And if we bring government closer to solve these problems, we're going to go a long way in helping all of these governance issues work better.
So one quick follow-up question on this, because I think it's a fascinating opportunity and challenge. Multi-stakeholder models that try to bring more people into these processes are really complicated. They're really cumbersome. All of us have spent a lot of time working in and around multi-stakeholder systems. But they also seem to be the only viable solution out there that does close that gap and get the right mix of expertise and legitimacy around the table to solve some of these problems. I think of them almost as the way that Winston Churchill described democracy. It is the worst solution except for all of the other solutions. Should we just embrace that reality and say, this is going to be complicated, this is going to be messy, but we're going to go all in on this, and governments are going to have to cede a little bit of power in order to make that happen, and citizens are going to have to step up, and civil society and the private sector are going to have to step up and participate in ways that we have not been accustomed to participating in the past?
Well, if anyone knows Tristan Harris with Humane Tech, he talks a lot about in his podcast, if you're not undivided attention, it's fantastic. And one of the things that's going on with our mind because of social media is we're looking for quick wins. And that means we don't We're not sitting into the hard things where we get satisfaction. And my thing around this is it's supposed to be hard. Why can't we embrace that it's hard? Let's disagree with one another. Let's have a fight here and there. It's sort of like, if it's not easy and fast, it's not good. Who ever taught you that in life? So I think we need to reframe. It's a much more psychological and philosophical point that you've got to get in and sort of get your seat in and be open and learn from one another. You cannot go in and just stake your claim, this is what it's going to be. You actually have to go in with an open mind. And very few people do that in governance discussions. It's they fight between territories. There's no way we will do that. So that mind shift is quite important. And folks in government are trying to get it because they know they're a big player in that.
So Dante, you've just been through this process. You've done this in the real world at a very high level on an incredibly ambitious project. Who do you need at the table to be successful? Who do you not need at the table to be successful? What were some of the considerations going through your mind as you established the Libra Council, and now you're the vice chair of that council? What's going to help you be successful in your work going forward?
Yeah, I think one, keeping your words to heart, that this is not the type of effort for which instant gratification is a good plan, right? And if we had any ideals about instant gratification, the world had a very different opinion the morning after. But it's partly about demonstrating common sort of cause, that when it's dark and fuzzy and there's a lot of pressure both internally and externally to get all these stakeholder interests aligned, the mission becomes bigger than the institutional grind, right? So I think that's at least kept me sane and kept me in front of cameras and keeps me here. The other issue then is to really demonstrate that there's an honest commitment, notwithstanding the fact that this is a 7-month-old startup effort, to getting this governance model right from the beginning. And so the operational trade-off is speed. Move fast and break things might have worked really, really well in a bygone era, but to challenge aspects of the financial system, to ensure that you're compliant, you need to have deference for what the regulator has done and why it exists. And the rules-based system did not just emerge from a vacuum. It emerged from the creator of the Great Recession and all of the issues that we've had ever since. And so I have absolutely enormous respect for public servants and for kind of getting public interest right. And for, so it's been difficult, to be very transparent. It's been enormously difficult. But every one of those members and eventually the next wave that come in are kind of sticking to mission alignment as the thing that will help us get through just the startup phase and the next couple of waves of work that we have to get right. But the tech, I think, is comparatively easy. I've always said this. Tech is the comparatively easy part, and I say that with absolute deference to my technologists in the room. It's the social coordination and the organizational coordination and the public interest alignment that makes projects of any scale complicated.
So Brian, to that point, one of the concepts that has started to percolate in recent years as a mechanism for addressing some of the capture issues that go along with existing societal platforms and the deficiencies that we all see and that Chairman Giancarlo spoke about very effectively around digital infrastructure is this idea of digital public goods. And you see this concept taking root a little bit in India, you see it in a handful of other jurisdictions, Estonia, Singapore. There is a realization that we need to build some infrastructure, and in the same way, in the 20th century, we built interstate highways and airports, and those provided the mechanisms for powering commerce and engagement and interaction. In the 20th century, we may need a new generation of digital infrastructure in the 21st century to fill an analogous role. Does that line up with what you're seeing in the work that you're doing at Hyperledger? And what do you see as some of the key elements of that digital infrastructure to the extent that it does?
Very much so. The digital identity is perhaps the most obvious kind of first place here. And moving away from, again, a master-slave centralized concept of your identity being your Facebook login or et cetera, and instead towards something that says your identity is a collection of documents about things you can prove about yourself and to present those to other people. A passport, a driver's license, a birth certificate, your credentials at different academic organizations, information about yourself as well that has been certified by parties, but basically it should be in your hands to decide when to share that to people, and no one should have the ability to disappear that information, because of a database error on the side of a server somewhere. this concept, self-sovereign identity, there's a multi-year effort that's gone on now, and is Accenture is a big part of it, IBM's a big part of it. Lots of companies are behind it around launching this kind of decentralized self-sovereign identity network. Standards out there that are really being baked into technologies. You'll hear more about it, I think, tomorrow in some of Accenture's talks here. This is it's kind of hard to wrap your head around at first, and then it becomes really easy and obvious. And governments are starting to go, this makes sense to us too. Canada, the Canadian government has really launched into this. The Dutch government as well, and the government of Sierra Leone also has sponsored efforts here. So it's that's one piece of it for sure. Being able to also take evidence that's created on other blockchain networks and wire that into the court systems and be able to present that as evidence with the same standing as, say, a physically signed document is something that I think is another step that we'll need in order to digitize a lot of the kind of bureaucratic processes we have out there. In China, the internet court system now has a blockchain-based, truly distributed between lots of organizations, way of verifying the integrity of documents that have been submitted as evidence in court. And they've wired up a lot of other types of finance networks and supply chain networks in there to allow for much more rapid adjudication and regulatory oversight of many of these processes. This is the kind of thing we need if we're going to digitalize these things without it becoming an opportunity for fraud, malfeasance, and corruption.
The flip side of what you just described occurring in some jurisdictions is that we have seen a handful of governments, and I am going to pick on the Chinese here, bring together big data technology and surveillance and fuse those tools with government in a way that really would make George Orwell blush. And it is astounding and at one level really impressive to see what they've been able to do with those tools. Western leaders are slowly starting to wake up to that reality. What they haven't really done is put forward an alternative.
Well, so I think every successful innovator has what I call the Oppenheimer moment, right? Oppenheimer, he saw the test at White Sands of the nuclear bomb, and he said, "I have become Kali, destroyer of worlds," right? I some mornings wake up worried that we'll discover Hyperledger fabric is being used to track the Uyghurs in Western China. Other mornings I wake up and worry that we'll hear that DHS is using it to track separated families at the border, right? So there are plenty of opportunities here. In open source software, it's kind of, you don't get the opportunity to limit what users do with the technology. What you hope to do is celebrate the beneficent uses, make it harder to do things that might be awkward, but you need that regulatory backstop. You need a sense of ethics in the deployment of these technologies, and that's what the human governance layer around the deployment of these networks has to be about.
You've given me a perfect opportunity to take the moderator's prerogative and provide a 30-second commercial break. So we work together with the Rockefeller Foundation and an array of other governments and partners around the world to develop open source platforms to power the public sector. And our goal, to the maximum extent possible, mindful of the fact that you can never perfectly determine the end uses for a lot of these technologies, is to hardwire in efficiency, accountability, security, integrity to the maximum extent possible, so that it becomes really, really challenging for governments to abuse these tools and really, really easy for them to provide high quality services and efficiency to their citizens. We build 80% solutions, so our goal is to have a really good core that can then be optimized and customized by different jurisdictions as they do their work. But one of the things that we have recognized, and I want to get your help thinking this through, Lisa, is that the reason democracies were so successful in the 20th century, and Yuval Harari has spoken about this at some length, is that decentralized systems, given the tools that were available at that time, were inherently more efficient and effective when it came to making decisions and processing information than centralized systems. There is no guarantee going forward in an age of AI that that's going to be the case. As you sit down with governments and think through the big challenges they are looking at right now, is there a willingness on the part of countries that have historically maintained respect for human rights as a core element of what they were and what they did? to build a new model, to create new systems that will incorporate these technologies, but do so in a way that respects rights and provides accountability to citizens?
It's a big question. The first principle response to it is governments that are clear about the values that are driving their problem solving do it very well. When they have a vision, and you talked about this, Dante, in the last round, that when they're clear, like what's most important to us. When you go to Sweden, safety and community is very important to them. Their regulators have a much easier time figuring out how to make laws and regs are not based on that. The countries that have figured out the values that are really driving them for this new age, I mean, we have this, I'm American, but I live in Germany, right? The Germans, this whole idea of cryptocurrency, like, and electronic payments come to Berlin. Like, you can't go anywhere without this. They are holding as a value their deep privacy, and Americans are giving their stuff away to Alexa left and right. That is, for an American regulator, that's such a hard, okay. So you want privacy and human rights, but you're giving Alexa everything for free, and you know that you are. I think this creates regulatory, like, schizophrenia and headache. I don't think we know what we want.
Well,
And if we don't know that, how do you solve problems against that? We have to make that collective decision. The Chinese know what they want. Stability, long-term thinking. The trade-off is just normal. Take everything about me, whether you choose to or not, but we're gonna grow together. We don't have that in many Western democracies, so we're crazy right now.
Help us, Dante.
yeah, no, well, I wish I could. I mean, so most of my career is risk management, resilience, and so, and the lesson on governance drawn from when bad things start to happen, a cyber risk issue, a community is underwater, is that you know where you had bad governance ex post facto when it fails.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge. I think the American ideals, our motto is e pluribus unum, out of many one, are meant for this new decentralized era of technology and blockchain and all these fine things. The challenge is that up until now, the experimentation has only been happening in the private sector. And the knowledge gap, frankly, on the public sector is very, very, very real, right? If you sat through the 9 hours of public testimony that I did, and you saw the questions, and you saw...
I only made it 4 hours through.
Thank you, by the way, yes, Tomicah was my wingman in one of them. Then you would see that we need to bridge that gap so that, again, the spectrum of possibility isn't all tech leads to Armageddon, but that there's an equilibrium point at which we could strike and make the process of institutional relationships more participatory. That's the missing link.
I want to ask you, Brian, for some additional help on this theme, because you have spent time in the public sector, you've been in the White House, you have also spent a lot of time creating successful, and there aren't that many examples out there, and you've been involved in a wildly disproportionate number of them, instances of multi-stakeholder governance in the technology space. What should governments learn from that experience? Because there is, as Dante says, he's absolutely right, there's a big gap right now around the knowledge base that exists in the minds of people like you and the knowledge of most of the folks who are trying to man the steam room and make government work the way it's supposed to work.
So one thing that has made open source software development governance always work is something called the right to fork, which was, if the four of us here are working on a software project, I have a great idea, but I can't convince the rest of them that it's a good idea. I can start with the same code, go off in my direction, build something, rally my own group around it, and either bring it back to them when it's obvious that it's a better idea, or fail on its own, and I come back, crawling on my hands and knees. But we can go our separate ways. And actually what's kind of brilliant about the public unpermissioned blockchain networks out there is they have this same right to fork. Bitcoin has forked, Ethereum has forked, often into ongoing viable branches, and that has been a release valve for tension at the governance layer of those organizations. You have a better idea, major groups can't agree, let's go try it out. That's not something you get to do when you're talking about a central bank digital currency, admittedly.
I was going to say, we tried that once in the 1860s in the US, and it did not turn out well, so I'm hoping that...
But, de Tocqueville did say that states are the laboratory of democracy, right? And I think the states and even municipalities are a place to experiment with not only new technologies, but governance around those technologies, and then to bubble those up. And obviously, countries of all sizes, right? The Bank of Cambodia has a functioning central bank payments platform on blockchain technology today that I know has been highlighted here at GBBC last year, and we're learning things from that, right? So I think the key thing is if these experiments can be done in public, if they can be done with the possibility of when parties disagree being able to go their own ways and circle back. And I think it might even mean building blockchain networks, even the permissioned blockchain networks, in such a way that the constituencies can experiment and they can cleave if they need to, as a release valve for pressure on leadership. How that happens, I'm still unsure about. But there's a lot to learn from the history of both open source and the public blockchain space and how that might work.
Lisa and Dante, similar question. If you're writing the book on this, what's the blueprint? What's the instruction manual look like, Lisa?
Well, I wanna answer that. My answer to all of that is study Danny Kahneman. For any of you who know him, because I think so many of the issues we have with this is a deep systems 1, systems 2, how your brain works. We're not communicating it. It's a very complex thing. We're communicating it too complexly. But what I'd like to answer that question by just rattling off how we're thinking about Agile governance in this new model. So what are the 10 points, just very quickly. So first, to think about this differently, the first chapter of the book would be do foresight. Very few countries actually have foresight units. It's very hard to regulate if you don't know or even think about what's coming. There's like 15 in the world, right? And lots of private sector, hire Accenture and everyone to say, look at the future, what we're gonna do. Second is, you talked about this at the last, don't focus on the technology, focus on the outcomes. Be tech neutral, and I think that's exciting. Experiment and learn. There are forks happening. They're called regulatory sandboxes. They're happening at greater speed, and which is great. Be much more responsive. So Dubai has a regulatory team where they're crunching their own financial numbers alongside of the financial markets, and they're comparing it back and forth so they can act more quickly. Bring business on board from the very beginning. There's been enemies and they haven't been able to speak the same language, and that's really, really breaking down. Connecting with peers. So that's something we do at the Agile Governance Council with about 20 governments who are working together saying, we don't need to recreate the wheel. If Cambodia did this, how can we do it? How can we change the concept? There's this thing called the internet. We can learn from one another. And then to your point, this is what triggered it for me. How do you coordinate at the sub-national level? How do you use those states as not experiments, never say experiments with citizens, as places to learn? You want to do that.
Nobody wants to be the subject of an experiment.
No, it's bad PR for your political people. And then last 3, global outlook. We have to think about this globally. We cannot, this whole sovereignty thing is fascinating, but we're living in a global world, so you have to think that. And then last I'll just say is really you have to put citizens at the center. Doing that right is so hard, but regulators are very much committed to doing that right.
We're going to open up for questions in just a moment, but Dante, I need you to bring us home. You guys are trying to solve some of the toughest challenges on the planet. You are building a system that's going to, if it works correctly, going to be a huge quantum leap forward in remittances, as you say, the most vital pipeline for getting capital to a lot of the global south, and go a long way to addressing payment considerations that all of us struggle with every day. But this is not easy work, as you previously articulated. What are the guidelines that you would suggest for people who want to solve problems on that scale in their countries and globally?
No small question. I think step 1 is, a deep commitment to getting it right. And this, I think, is an enormous lesson learned, particularly for our Silicon Valley partners in this project, that deference to rules, deference to the system, deference to governance, and deference to public interest are enormously important. As a result, I've treated the last 6.5 months as a consultation period. And I promise you, everything we have heard is now being taken in and absorbed and being considered as a part of the design principles for this project. Step 1. Step 2, you cannot use any of the organizations that are a part of this as quote-unquote fig leaves. I was particularly offended when our colleagues in the nonprofit space were called as humanitarian fig leaves to masquerade this enormous sort of greedy capitalistic venture. Every one of those organizations has a commitment, I think, to the vision that is bigger than, and to some extent has also created internal risks for them and market risk and others, bigger than themselves. And so if you're building infrastructure that can serve so many people, the realization, including of some of the partners involved, that this is not an effort you could do on your own, that you have to go together, is the key. And so as we move forward and as we sort of continue the work in 2020, job one is to get it right. And I think the measure that we're starting to get it right is that we've achieved a regulatory standard and a licensing regime for this process that protects public interest, that acknowledges that we didn't launch this effort in a void of GDPR, and that there's a chance to harmonize that kind of consumer protection and sort of consumer observation around the world, and not do what we often do in technology and in business, which is sort of arbitrage. We find the place of lowest operational standards, and then we make that the base of operations. We've chosen the hard path, is to try to arbitrage to the highest operating standard and then make that the harmony that would sort of reflect across the ecosystem. Those are enormously big ideals, enormously complex standards to achieve, and the tech, mercifully, is moving ahead full steam, working exceedingly well. It's the governance piece and the alignment of public interest that is the hardest. So I'll be able to report back to you in a year on how that goes.
Well, with that as backdrop, we have a few minutes to collect some input, feed that into your processes and the work that Brian and Lisa are involved in. We're going to take 3 questions at a time to try and move this as efficiently as possible, and we will start with the amazing Jeff Saviano from EY.
Oh, Tomicah, you're too kind. Thank you so much for the invitation today. Really appreciate the panel and the discussion. I'd be interested in your thoughts on the issue of governance and how it aligns to financing the technology. It seems like getting multi-stakeholders together around a table to govern when there's no money exchanging hands is hard enough. Then when you start to look to those stakeholders for actually financing the initiative, it becomes almost impossible. I'd be interested in your thoughts on how do you integrate the two? How do you fundraise for an important initiative and do it in a way not to disincentivize others for joining later, if that makes sense?
Marvelous question. Next, please.
Hi, Dr. Norman from London Stock Exchange Group. So I actually had a fairly broad question and just kind of thinking about things in the abstract. So it strikes me that from a governance perspective, you can't necessarily think about governance without necessarily considering information. When I say information, I'm really speaking about information symmetry and then information trust. And so I'd really love to hear your thoughts around information symmetry in terms of kind of when you consider that if you broaden access to governance, if you bring in more participants to make decisions, how do you ensure that they equally have access to the same base level of information in order to make the right decision and prevent kind of perverse incentives from driving decision making and creating bias? And trust is more around preventing misinformation being spread and propagated and distributed through that network.
Fantastic. And one more in the back, please.
Let's play it safe. Thank you. My name is Jose Elpino. I'm part of the management team of OpenSC. We're a supply chain traceability platform co-founded by WWF and BCG Digital Ventures, and we're a profit-for-purpose business. And as part of my role, I think about how can we decentralize, sort of as a long-term vision, the governance of this company. And Dante, I think it was you who said that the more complex problem is around establishing the rules and not so much the technology. And then I thought, well, what happened with the DAO in 2017? And how can we prevent that today? And my question for you, Brian, would be, what are the most current technologies today to apply sort of decentralized governance as a technology layer that could, avoid the issues that we had a couple of years ago?
So we have finance. How do we finance this stuff from Jeff? And here I'm going to pause for another commercial break. Jeff will be on this stage tomorrow at 5 p.m. announcing an incredibly exciting open source collaboration around tax and public revenue. So please join us for that. But it's a really, really critical question. Symmetry, information symmetry and information trust, and then decentralized governance. Brian, you look like you're ready.
I started
to go.
with a bit of Jeff's. It's obviously a long story. Our premise is a lot of the technology development, a lot of the standards development can actually be done by tapping into corporate intrinsic motivators rather than extrinsic motivators. Meaning, companies want to be in a business in a certain domain. There's a lot of table stakes type of development they need to do that's non-differentiating. Making the case to collaborate on that, even to put in a little bit of a share amongst other parties, you pull the right people around the table, is not a big leap. That's something Linux Foundation has done repeatedly in this space, right? When it comes to operating a network, right, you can start with that, but once you're at scale, you do need to find some ways to compensate the people who are really, greasing the gears and keeping things up and running. And that's where network fees make a lot of sense in one way or another. And either a very decentralized way to compensate for that. I'm not a big fan of mining for environmental reasons, but I think there's a lot of ways to compensate for that. And you'll see, I think, interesting governance models emerge around that aren't as exciting at a crypto layer, but just exciting at a chance to see it out there and deployed. To answer sorry, what was your name again? Jose's question. One of my mentors was Tim O'Reilly, and one of his quotes was, create more value than you capture. And I think there's a lot of things that businesses can do to launch a product that ends up leaving some value on the table for your customers, that ends up with you creating kind of an enabling technology that doesn't grow to become a rent-seeking platform. Right, and Red Hat might be an example of this. As a participant in the Linux community, sold lots of services, even some products around it, but fundamentally was enabling technology for their members. Right, I'm a bigger fan of that kind of strategy than I am necessarily of a DAO. Right, or trying to have an automated process, which. I don't think we found a way to avoid bugs in a lot of that code, and that's an awfully risky strategy to take. If you can't prevent bugs at that layer, but I do think there might be another kind of thread through that, which is pursuing the concept of minimum viable governance, finding a way to create a lightweight human organization with just enough power to be able to balance the interests, set some standards, set up the compensation structure, and try to keep it to 5 people or 6 people or less, right? And then your company, for example, or other people's companies come in as technology suppliers, solution providers, trainers, enablers, building apps on top. That's a really rich ecosystem and avoids any one party becoming, a monster in the middle.
One quick note, both on Jeff's question and on Jose's, we've seen some fascinating examples emerge from the public sector that we think could be applied by the tech community. So if you think about initiatives like GAP, the Global Alliance for Vaccination and Immunization, which initially used governance and capital from the philanthropic sector to jumpstart what is now a very robust multi-stakeholder initiative that's vaccinated 750 million people and prevented tens of millions of deaths. There's some intriguing possibilities there. Similarly, if you look at what's happened with NATO and collective defense, you can envision scenarios in which you would have organizations band together and commit to help each other out when they come under attack or face common challenges around security. So there's some very intriguing models that can be transported from other places.
Could I just make a point? It's kind of next to your point. It's a little bit different, but I think I'd be remiss if I didn't bring it up. As we talk about innovation and governance, a lot of companies don't get the shot that they can to really make the change because of procurement challenges. Oftentimes, government will be the biggest buyer and the incumbents really have the advantage. And there's a real procurement revolution going on around the world, maybe aided by blockchain in a big way to stop the corruption, but also ensuring that these small and local businesses get a chance to come on board. And I think we can get behind doing those things differently. Creates a great market for big companies to go buy those markets anyway, basically paid for by the citizens. I'd say the other is, it's controversial, but it's interesting to look at, and I haven't done enough research on this, but when governments get involved in funding some of these things. So there's the Horizon 2020 grant that does a lot of funding in this space. We just got a grant from them. Non-dilutive capital alongside traditional investors, really helpful. The UK has a pioneer fund for things that normally wouldn't get funded because the regs are so against it, but they want to create innovation. So I know the conventional wisdom is government shouldn't be in the funding innovation space, but when regulations hold things back, I think there's opportunities to do things differently.
Dante.
Yeah, so I think, the balancing act that Jose brought up around governance and sort of this notion of DAOs and things that just could exist in an entire vacuum, it becomes difficult to do that when you're attacking highly regulated issues. You need a neck to choke and an address to serve a subpoena to or a summons to, right? So.
Did you say neck to choke?
Yeah, unfortunately. Ring. But that's part of the trade-off, because you can't have your cake and eat it too. We have to have models in which there are really broad-based, open source, collaborative technologies, but then there is a center point where there's some degree of accountability. And that is answerable to, and that is part of sort of a learning model that can drive improvements. We've all learned the hard way that when technologies fail and there's no one there, consumers are left with no recourse. The Quadriga CX example in Canada is a teachable moment in how that can work. On the question of funding, I do think when you think about what a lot of these types of investments represent to the private and public sector, for the private sector, it's co-opetition is partly the motive. And to have a seat at the table and help catalyze a flywheel of something that's new and becomes fascinating, better to be in than out. And for the public sector, I think there are co-investment vehicles that are non-dilutive, that are very interesting, but then the net result is something that sort of lifts all ships. So it's a market expansion moment rather than just preserving status quo. And then last, I think this informational asymmetry question is one of the very, very biggest challenges we've got. And so the more the open source code base flattens the access to the opportunity and to the developer community, the more the technology enables a democratization of value capture, value shared, and so on, the more we can get a lot of this stuff right. But asymmetry is the biggest problem of information. You could exploit people when there's asymmetries of information. So here too, I think there's a big chance to get a lot of things right.
The folks you see on this stage are each working in different ways to create the next generation of digital public goods that we spoke about a little bit. This is only going to happen once in our history. We don't know how this story ends, but it's an incredibly exciting time. We have had breakthroughs in technology. That much I think is pretty clear to anyone who's been able to fog a mirror over the last 20 years. What we now need, what we are now seeing, are breakthroughs in governance. It's going to take collaboration from all of the folks on the stage, all the folks in this room, to make those breakthroughs happen. But as they do, we are going to be able to do extraordinary things. And we look forward to collaborating with you to realize that potential together. Thank you.
Thank you very much.